All right, so this is the fourth video for chapter 18 on leukocytes. So moving on to talk about our white blood cells, the second formed element that we're discussing in this chapter. So leukocytes, quick characteristics here, less numerous than red blood cells. We already discussed that red blood cells are the most numerous, so that goes without saying, but nonetheless, here you go. We got about 4,800 to 10,800 leukocytes per microliter of blood. These guys, in contrast with red blood cells, which have ejected their nucleus and have lost just about all of their organelles, leukocytes are actually true cells. They have nuclei, they have organelles, they're competent to pull off metabolism, so they're living cells. They're also different from red blood cells in the sense that there are multiple types of white blood cells, so we'll look at those here in this section. Red blood cells are red blood cells, there's just one type. White blood cells, you've got a variety, so that's a difference. Also, leukocytes don't have hemoglobin. That is particular to red blood cells for carrying oxygen, so you don't see that red color. That's why they're called white blood cells. Another difference between leukocytes and erythrocytes is that erythrocytes are permanently in the blood stream inside your blood vessels. They don't leave. If you have leaking red blood cells from your vessels, you've got problems. But leukocytes can, and they do. So they're going to leave the bloodstream to head towards areas of the body that might be injured or infected to participate in that fight, in that immune fight. So you can hear that described as emigration or diapedesis, and they both mean pretty much the same thing. It just means leaving the vessels and entering into tissues to participate in defense. Once they leave the bloodstream, white blood cells might settle permanently into tissues, so they sort of take up residence in a particular area and keep guard there. Or you have some that continue to wander about freely within the tissue, kind of looking for things to protect you against. And then you have others still that are following chemical signals. That might be signals from tissues that are damaged. It might be signals, chemicals that are being secreted by bacterial pathogens. There's some chemical that is giving the sign to these white blood cells that there's an issue that they need to check out. And so they'll follow those chemical signals. And the term for following a chemical is called chemotaxis. It just means movement in response to a chemical stimulus. You can see positive chemotaxis, which is moving toward a chemical signal, which is what we're discussing here in this case. You will also see examples of negative chemotaxis, where you have cells that move away from certain chemical stimuli. So that's also a thing, and just something to make note of. There's a really good figure in your textbook. It's figure 1810 on emigration, and it gives you a nice schematic of sort of how those white blood cells squeeze out of the vessels and head into the tissues and what they do. So the 5 types of leukocytes that we're going to look at are just pictured here for you. We're going to look at those in more detail as we go through this section. Starting with the first type of leukocytes, and those are called granulocytes. You've got granulocytes, which we're looking at here. The next slide we'll take a look at are called agranulocytes. And the difference is the presence of easily visible granules. And those granules are little particles. Think about like granulated sugar, right? A granule or grains of sand, right? Those are granules. In the case of granulocytes, these little particles, these little granules are actually little tiny sacs. So they have chemicals in them. These chemicals are going to be specific to the type of cell that you're talking about. So each cell has its own role to play, and the chemicals that are contained inside of those granules are specific to that particular role or that cellular function. So granulocytes are named for the fact that you can see those granules easily when the cells are stained on a microscope slide. So the 3 granulocytes are neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophils. Just to quickly show you guys, the other 2, the agranulocytes, we'll talk about those next. They end in cyte, monocyte and lymphocyte. So that's a really good way to sort of remember which ones are which. So if it ends in PHIL, it's a granulocyte. And if it ends in CYTE, it's an agranulocyte. So that's just like a little trick to look at. So let's look at the 3 types. The most common type is the neutrophil. It's also called a polymorphonuclear cell because its nucleus can take on multiple shapes. So poly meaning many, morpho meaning shape. So polymorphonuclear means many shaped nucleus. So sometimes you'll hear them referred to as polymorphonuclear leukocytes or PMNs, but those are neutrophils. So for our purposes, I'll refer to them as neutrophils. So you don't have to know the other name for any quizzes or tests that you'll have in this class, but just sort of make mental note of that. It might also help you to remember which is which, because you've got this multi-lobed nucleus. So it's got that sort of strange multi-form shape to it. Okay, so that's a neutrophil. Neutrophils make up about 50 to 70% of your total white blood cell count. So they are by far the most numerous. They're called neutrophils because they are they retain both sets of stain. So on a stain that you are making when you're making a stained blood slide, like what we're looking at here, there's a stain and there's a counter stain. You've got acidic and you've got alkaline stains, but the neutrophil takes up both. So if you notice, the eosinophil is red, the basophil is more blue, but the neutrophil is kind of a neutral color in between the two, and that's because it picks up both of those stains. So it's sort of like a light pinkish lilac color. The granules are visible, but they are least dense in your granulocytes. The neutrophils have the least visible, smallest granules. So they're there. They stain a light purple color, but they are not as obvious in a neutrophil as they are in something like an eosinophil or a basophil. And you guys are looking at these in your lab materials as well. So this is probably review from that, but we're talking about, we're gonna talk about it in both sections because repetition is helpful with this type of stuff. Okay, so you've got your multi-lobed nucleus. There might be 2 lobes, there might be as many as 5 lobes, but that's something to look for with a neutrophil. These guys are phagocytes. So phagocytosis is cell eating. Okay, so anytime you see the word phagocyte or phagocytosis, it's talking about cells that go out and engulf other cells. It might be debris, it might be pathogens, it could be parts of cells that are being broken down and digested and recycled, like when red blood cells are taken apart. So phagocytosis just means one cell engulfs something else. Okay, so neutrophils are phagocytic. They are rapid responders. They head straight to the site of an infection or tissue damage, and they bring with them these granules that contain lysozymes, which are enzymes that help to digest things that they've engulfed, oxidants, which are sort of like cellular toxins to other, say they encounter a bacterial pathogen, for example, an oxidant can be toxic to that bacterial cell, things like peroxide, things that can cause damage to other cells. And then defensins, which are also chemicals that protect against bacterial invaders. So those are neutrophils. Eosinophils are the next most numerous type of granulocyte. And as you can see, there are far fewer eosinophils than neutrophils. Neutrophils can be as much as 70% of your white blood cells. Eosinophils max out at 4%. So very drastic drop off in numbers compared to the two. Eosinophils, as we mentioned, stain a bright red because they retain that particular type of stain. And they also have a lobed nucleus, but it's going to be 2 or 3. It's never going to be as many as 5 like you see in a neutrophil. Eosinophils are associated with allergic reactions. They are also involved in fighting infections with parasitic worms and in certain autoimmune diseases. The granules in an eosinophil contain antihistamines, so they're going to help to fight inflammation. Okay, they also, some of their granules have toxins inside of them that are specifically poisonous or toxic to those parasitic worms. So the understanding of their function is that they would have evolved as a protective mechanism against parasitic worm infections. If you live in a place where that is not a common problem, if you live in a place where you have clean water and clean food and you're not frequently ingesting parasitic worms, the eosinophils are more likely to be involved in things like allergies, where your body is overreacting to things that shouldn't be overreacting to, like pollen or pet dander. And there's kind of an interesting idea that it's because they don't have anything else to do. Okay, so that's kind of neither here nor there, but the idea behind this is that that's what eosinophils are involved with. And then basophils are your least common granulocyte of all, making up less than 1% of your total white blood cell count. They stain dark purple. They do have a bilobed nucleus, so that is something that you can look for, but oftentimes with basophils, the nucleus is difficult to see because the granules are so numerous and they stain so dark that they can obscure the nucleus. The granules make the nucleus difficult to see. So just look for purple, look for granules, and that's going to give you basophil, okay? Basophils are also associated with allergic reactions and parasitic infections. Hypothyroidism is also an indication when you see basophil involvement. But interestingly, their granules contain histamine as opposed to antihistamine. So basophils are going to actually use those histamine chemicals to trigger inflammation, whereas eosinophils have antihistamines which fight inflammation. So they sound kind of similar, but they do different things with the chemicals inside of their granules. The granules in basophils also can contain heparin, which is an anticoagulant, or it helps to keep blood from clotting. So those are some chemicals that you find in basophils. So those are your three types of granulocytes. So let's look at our agranulocytes. That's your lymphocytes and your monocytes. They are, as I mentioned, called agranular, not because they don't have any granules at all, because they do, but the granules are really small and they don't stain the same way that those in the granulocytes do, and so you can't really see them. So they look to be absent of granules, and sometimes you'll see in notes or in a textbook or in Wikipedia or whatever you're looking at that agranulocytes lack granules. Just, it doesn't really matter, that's fine. Just keep in mind that they may have them, but you can't see them. So when you're using the distinction of granules or no granules to identify a cell based on appearance, that works fine. Okay, so if you can see them, granulocyte. If you can't see them, agranulocyte. Additionally, the nuclei are more simply shaped. So you don't have the multi-lobe sort of polymorphonuclear look of a neutrophil or even the 2 or 3 lobes of an eosinophil, but you have more of a sort of standard nucleus shape, and we'll look a little bit at the difference between those two here. So thinking back to the first video, when we were looking at the differentiation of blood cells, and we talked about the fact that you've got myeloid stem cells and you've got lymphoid stem cells, and the lymphoid stem cells only give rise to lymphocytes. So your lymphocytes are those that originate from the lymphoid stem cells in the red bone marrow, but many of them are going to complete their maturation process in lymphatic tissues. So they're going to move out of the red bone marrow and into tissues like the thymus or spleen or things like that. But we're going to cover that in a lot more detail in the chapter on immune cells. So when we get to that point, we'll cover that in a lot more detail, as I mentioned. But just keep in mind that these guys come from lymphoid stem cells, but they're lymphocytes, so that makes sense. You've got about 20 to 40% of your white blood cell count here. So lymphocytes are the second most numerous type of leukocyte. Okay, so listen, let me say that again, just so it makes sense. If you look back at your neutrophils, they're number one. They're the most abundant with 50 to 70% of your white blood cell count. When you look at eosinophils and basophils, that percentage drops way, way down. So in between the neutrophils, which are the most abundant, and basophils and eosinophils, which are less abundant, you've got lymphocytes, which make up 20 to 40%. So they're sort of number two in line, okay, as far as abundance of cells in your white blood cell, total white blood cell count. The nucleus is often large. So you can see in this picture here, this is a really good schematic or example of a micrograph of a lymphocyte. This whole area in the middle, this dark stained purple area, that is nucleus. The cytoplasm is what they describe as this halo around the nucleus. So most of the cell is actually full of nucleus, and there's a little ring of cytoplasm around it. So that is characteristic of lymphocytes. If you see that, that's a good indicator that that's the type of cell that you're looking at. Now, lymphocytes are going to differentiate into 3 different types. So there are 3 different sort of categories of lymphocytes. You've got your natural killer cells or NK cells, and then you have your cells that are going to become T cells and B cells. The natural killer cells are non-specific, which means they don't attack one particular type of pathogen, but they go around looking for things that look off. So they participate a lot in self versus non-self. So they recognize things that just don't look like your own cells. They also look for cells that are yours, but are acting abnormally. So things that are infected, cells that are infected with a virus are going to look weird. Cells that are cancerous are going to look weird. So the NK cells, natural killer cells, their whole job is just to go around and get rid of those abnormal or foreign looking bodies. So they're part of your non-specific innate immune system. And again, when we get to that chapter, we're going to spend more time talking about the roles of these cells. But this is just a nice introduction to that particular type of lymphocyte. And then compare that with T cells and B cells. Again, there's a lot of detail that we'll go into about those types of cells, and they have lots of different jobs. But a good contrast to start with between NK cells and T cells versus T cells and B cells is that T and B cells are going to be part of your adaptive immunity or specific responses to particular types of antigens. So these are going to be the cells that are responsible for producing antibodies. So there are certain types of B cells that produce antibodies to defend you against future infections. The T cells and B cells are those that can create memory cells that remember that you've been infected with a particular type of pathogen and then can help to protect you against it should it show up again later. So those are going to be, again, covered in a lot more detail later. But just for now, know that natural killer cells and T and B cells are all your 3 different types of lymphocytes. Okay, very important in immune response. And then the last type of agranulocyte, or the second type, are your monocytes. Monocytes make up between 2 and 8% of your white blood cell count. They're large cells, and they have what we describe as a horseshoe-shaped nucleus. So if you see that sort of U-shape or horseshoe-shaped nucleus, think monocyte. They're also, again, large. They are one of the types of white blood cells that leave circulation. And when they do that, then they're called macrophages. So basically, macrophage means big eater. So it just wanders around, gobbling stuff up, deciding whether it's something that you need to be concerned about. So it's sort of like the guard cells of your immune system. They can be fixed inside of particular types of tissue. So they'll leave the bloodstream, find where they're supposed to be, and then just hang out there, sort of on monitoring duty. Or you have wandering macrophages, which just sort of wander around and look for things to phagocytize. And they'll, again, pick up things like cellular debris, bits and pieces, right, of broken down cells, pathogens, dead or worn out cells. So these are those that are going to be picking up those red blood cell bits and pieces that are as they're being broken down. And they can also secrete defensins and other chemical signals that are going to help to signal other white blood cells to come help fight an infection. Okay, so all of these white blood cells are involved in immunity or the immune response in one way or another, but they all have sort of slightly different, unique functions. All right, the last thing I want to talk about before moving on is a mnemonic device or a memory trick to help you remember the order of most abundant to least abundant leukocyte types. And it is never let monkeys eat bananas. Okay, so N for neutrophil, L for lymphocyte, M for monocyte, E for eosinophil, B for basophil. So never let monkeys eat bananas. That might help you remember which one is the most abundant and all the way down to least. So just a little trick there. All right, so there are a couple of disorders of leukocytes that are listed for you in your outline and also in the textbook. So we're going to do this the same way as we did with the erythrocyte disorders. If you see them in the PowerPoint and the outline, those are probably the ones that you need to know. So if you see other disorders listed in the outline that aren't listed in the PowerPoint, you're probably less likely to see questions about those on the exam. So just hint, hint. Okay, so these are the ones you probably want to make sure that you're familiar with. And the definitions are in the outline for you, but we can just run through them quickly here. Leukopenia, sometimes also referred to as leukocytopenia, means the same thing. It just means you have too low of a white blood cell count. Sometimes cancer treatments can do this. These are rapidly dividing cells. So anytime that you have something that is targeting rapidly dividing cells, like chemotherapy, you're also going to see decreases in these types of cells. So that's a possibility. Other certain types of drugs and advanced HIV infection or AIDS, you can also see, of course, a decrease in white blood cell numbers. So the term for that is leukopenia or leukocytopenia. On the flip side, you have leukocytosis, which is too many white blood cells or abnormally high numbers of white blood cells. Sometimes it indicates infection. Sometimes it indicates other types of things, especially if those white blood cells are non-functional. So if you have an abnormally high count, sometimes they're also not doing what they're supposed to be doing, and that's described as leukocytosis. You may have heard of leukemia. Leukemia is cancer of the leukocytes. So you can have myeloid leukemia, or lymphoid leukemia, and it just depends on what type of cell is dividing uncontrolled. So it can be either of those. It can also be chronic or acute. So that has to do with what type of cell is actually cancerous. Are they mature cells that don't die when they should, and so you end up with too many, or are they abnormally forming juvenile cells? So that has to do with whether it's chronic or acute. But you just may have heard those terms before, so it doesn't hurt to sort of go over what that is, just to sort of touch on it. And then finally, you've got lymphoma. And lymphoma is specifically cancer of the T cells or B cells in lymphatic tissue. So you may or may not have heard of Hodgkin's lymphoma or non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. It just means that you have too many of one or the other types of cells, and the lymphocytes are non-functional even though there are too many of them. So you are vulnerable to infection. And those are have various types of treatment. Some are more aggressive and require more aggressive treatment, and some are less lethal if treated. So those are your leukocyte disorders. And that wraps it up for the fourth part of chapter 18 on leukocytes.